Hi, and welcome back to this week's Chronicle. Today is Wednesday, March 19th, 2025. Heat can age you as much as smoking, a new study finds. Older people in Los Angeles' Chinatown neighborhood shade themselves from the sun. Exposure to heat can change the way people's genes work, potentially leading to long-term health impacts. Climate change is making heat waves more intense and last longer in many parts of the U.S. Phoenix heat is notorious for the harm it causes in the short term. Like heat stroke and heart problems. Just last year, temperatures there topped 90 degrees Fahrenheit for a record-breaking 188 days. For more than 140 of those days, surpassed 100 degrees. A new study published in Science Advances shows that prolonged heat exposure of that magnitude can modify how people's genes behave, speeding up aging at the molecular level and potentially impacting people's long-term health. The impact is similar to the effect of smoking and drinking, says Yuwang Choi, a gerontologist and the study's lead researcher. The study looked at people over 56 living across the country with very different heat experiences. People from extremely hot parts of the country, like Phoenix, where the heat index, a combination of temperature and humidity, topped 90 degrees for more than half the year, looked biologically about 14 months older. Epigenetically, than similar people living in cooler places like Seattle, where fewer than 10 days of each year exceed that threshold. That may not sound like an enormous difference, says Boston University gerontologist Deborah Carr, who wasn't involved in the study. But for the person affected, it's just a tremendous strain, not only on their own lives and the lives of their families and caregivers, but also the larger social issue, like dementia, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. The sooner these symptoms begin, the more of a toll they take on people's well-beings and productivity, Carr says. If that's something that takes you out of the workforce for a year, that makes you go to the doctors every day for a year, that increases your medication budget. It can really have tremendous impacts, she explains. Epigenetic aging. The researchers tracked the biological age of people in their study by looking for subtle changes in their DNA. After different periods of exposure to heat, from a few days of extreme temperatures to several years. We know that some people seem to age faster than others, and that's because biological aging doesn't always match chronological aging. Troy says, biological aging is often correlated with chemical tags that accumulate and are shed from people's DNA over time, a process called methylation. It is often referred to as epigenetic aging. DNA methylation acts like a light switch for genes, so it can turn off and on, Troy says. Methylation doesn't change the genes themselves, but modifies the way those genes work, sometimes for the better. But oftentimes not. Many studies in both animals and humans have shown that DNA methylation patterns change over time. And can be used as sort of a molecular clock, ticking along as people age. Epigenetic aging can accelerate because people don't eat well or don't get enough exercise, but it also associated with emotional or physical stress, as well as exposure to environmental harms like air pollution, and in this case, heat, Troy says. The researchers looked at blood samples from more than 3,600 older adults across the U.S. and assessed people's epigenetic age. They could figure out how much heat those people experienced over a few days, a few months, 1 year, and 6 years prior to that sample collection using climate and weather models looking into the past, taking into account both temperature and humidity, factors that influence the danger of different heat conditions. The outcomes were clear. People who experienced more heat over the long term aged faster. Biologically, than those living in cooler places. That's even after taking into account people's financial status, education, physical activity, and whether they smoked. Researchers have known for years that heat exposure correlates with long-term issues like worsened risk of cardiac problems. But the mechanisms for how that happens haven't been clear, says Tom Clanton, a physiologist and heat expert at the University of Florida's College of Health and Human Performance, how those delayed effects might happen. At the genome level, heat exposure makes you sort of accelerate your way towards an old heart. And an old vulnerable heart, he says. Climate pressures. Heat causes plenty of short-term health problems for people of all ages. The number of emergency department visits rises during heat waves. But does the number of cardiovascular issues, kidney problems, and even deaths not directly linked to the heat? The risks as human-driven climate changes accelerate, says Troy. The number of extreme heat days in the U.S. could rise by 20 to 30 days across. National Climate Assessment. A comprehensive accounting of past and potential future changes to the country because of climate change. At the same time, as heat risks grow because of climate change, Carr says the U.S. population is aging. Older people's bodies generally deal with heat less adeptly than younger people. Sweating capacity decreases. Less blood flows to the skin where it can be cooled. Some medications interfere with people's ability to manage heat. But heat makes life harder for everybody, not just older people, says Robert Mead, a heat physiology expert at Harvard University's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. It basically like if you're trying to tread water and someone's handing you a brick, he says. It's extra strain on all our physiological systems. It's just an extra weight that needs to be responded to in order to maintain homeostasis. The next step to connect heat exposure to specific health problems, Mead thinks, is to further personalize the analysis, because even within the hottest parts of the country, people experience in their own homes, whether they're in an overheated mobile unit or they have air conditioning available, can be wildly different temperatures, he says. Researchers indicate that the next frontier of this work should look at how heat exposure within people's homes shapes health outcomes. That kind of specific, personalized risk assessment could help scientists further pinpoint exactly how heat hurts people, Mead says, and maybe even how to prevent the damage or reverse it. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, sues Trump administration over canceled contract. The Trump administration has put journalists at government-funded broadcasters, including Prague-based Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, on leave on March 15th as it froze funding to them. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, sued the Trump administration on Tuesday to try to block it from terminating all federal funds for the U.S.-backed broadcaster. In a federal lawsuit, the network argues that the U.S. Agency for Global Media, USAGM, has violated the Constitution and federal laws by withholding money Congress expressly allocated for the broadcaster. USAGM distributes funds to U.S.-backed international networks, including Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, that serve foreign lands without a free or robust press. This is not the time to seed to rain to the propaganda and censorship of America's adversaries, said Stephen Kappas, the president and chief executive of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, in a statement. We believe the law is on our side, and that the celebration of our demise by despots around the world is premature. The network says it presents news and information to 47 million people each week in 27 languages across 23 countries, including Afghanistan, Hungary, Iran, Pakistan, Russia, and Ukraine. It is part of a historic effort at soft power launched in 1950 to reach people living behind the Iron Curtain. It aims to advertise American ideals by presenting the news in its complexity, even when it involves debate or dissent. The lawsuit names U.S. AGM and two officials, Senior Advisor Kari Lake and Acting Chief Executive Victor Morales. The agency, Lake and Morales, have not responded to NPR's request for comment. Former U.S. AGM General Counsel David Gleigerman who left the agency as Trump took office for a second time, says the network had no choice but to sue. They have no other option. Kleigerman says, none of the entities would want to enter litigation against the government. They receive their funds from the government. The relationship that the statute envisions is one of cooperation and coordination. The Trump administration has something different in mind. On Friday, Congress passed a stopgap spending bill that included continuing funds for the agency and the network it funds. Later that night, the White House put an executive order commanding the U.S. Agency for Global Media to limit its activities only to those that are statutorily required, that is, by law. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's lawsuit articulates the need for the network and the value of the mission. It rests its case, however, on the idea that Congress has passed laws requiring the agency to spend the money and that providing its coverage is legally required. This case challenges a federal agency's refusal to abide by Congress's power of the purse. The lawsuit states in its opening lines, it adds that the question of whether to pass along those funds in the form of annual grants is not an optional choice for the agency to make. It is the law. The legal argument appears to echo one made by current and former employees of the U.S. Agency for International Development in court. A federal judge ruled earlier Tuesday that the Trump administration is likely violated the Constitution when it effectively shuttered the agency. Lake acted over the weekend to shut down the Voice of America and Radio TV Marti, which owned by the federal government. She also revoked contracts by distributing the money Congress allocated for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and their sister networks, including Radio Free Asia and the Middle East Broadcasting Networks. These networks are private, not-for-profit corporations that are fully funded by the U.S. Congress. Lake also terminated the contract of the Open Tech Fund, which helped develop the open source technology Signal and other secure messaging systems. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, is the first of the networks to challenge Lake's actions. In a tweet Monday, she also revoked contracts distributing the money Congress allocated for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and their sister networks, including Radio Free Asia and the Middle East Broadcasting Networks. These networks are private, not-for-profit corporations that are fully funded by the U.S. Congress. Lake also terminated the contract for the Open Tech Fund, which helped develop the open source technology Signal and other secure messaging systems. Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Liberty is the first of the networks to challenge Lake's actions. In a tweet Monday, Lake argued, "There's too much rot in the United States agency for global media to salvage." She previously had said the networks offered value, but were in need of dramatic reform. Appearing on the podcast of Steve Bannon, the Trump's former chief political strategist, Lake appeared to anticipate the lawsuit and others and taunted the network's leaders. "They've probably worked all weekend. I hope they didn't get any sleep," Lake told Steve Bannon. "We're going to continue to move forward and do what President Trump's executive order said." U.S. AGM on Saturday put all Voice of America staffers on indefinite paid leave, terminated all of its hundreds of contractual employees with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the other outfits. The moves were denounced by congressional Democrats, international diplomats, and some Republicans. Yet they were hailed by MAGA loyalists in the U.S. and autocratic regimes abroad. Authorities in Russia and China openly rejoiced a dog's death for a dog. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said. Similarly, the Global Times, the English language tabloid owned by the Chinese Communist Party, celebrated the shuttering of the voice of America. Almost every malicious falsehood about China has VOA's fingerprints all over it. They want to control the information landscape, and they don't see any value in exporting a press and securing good wool with the people who are the subjects of our enemies, says Libby Liu, the former Radio Free Asia president and former Open Technology Fund CEO. China, she says, remains a strategic foe. They're seeking to fight us 24/7. Liu says they're fomenting misinformation and disinformation to alienate people from the United States. They're seeking global dominance. Why are we vacating the information space to the enemy? City crews have begun painting over the Black Lives Matter street mural in D.C. Crews in Washington, D.C. have begun painting over the city's Black Lives Matter street mural, a notable symbol of the 2020 protests against the killing of George Floyd, after a Republican bill targeting the mural threatened city funding. Reconstruction on DC's Black Lives Matter Plaza began on Monday, March 10th. The phrase Black Lives Matter has been painted in June 2020 on the pavement in the city in uppercase yellow letters, covering 2 blocks on 16th Street, about a quarter mile from the White House. In 2021, Mayor Muriel Bowser said the mural would become permanent to commemorate the protests. But last week, Representative Andrew Clyde, Republican from Georgia, introduced a bill calling the city to paint over the mural and rename the area Liberty Plaza, or lose federal funds. The mural inspired millions of people and helped our city through a very painful period. And now we can't afford to be distracted by meaningless congressional interference, Bowser wrote on X. A group of people gathered nearby to see the painting in its final moments on Monday. There's no such thing as erasure, D.C. resident Adrienne Lind said. If that's an attempt, it's just not possible to do. It's not just that we saw it, the whole world saw it. Floyd was killed in 2020 by former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, who kneeled on his neck for several minutes. His death sparked nationwide demonstrations that summer, including in D.C., where at one point, peaceful protesters were met with violence and tear gas by federal law enforcement. Bowser told NPR's Morning Edition on Monday, the mural helped the city through a very dark time in American history. It's going to evolve, absolutely, she said, though she did not provide further clarification on what the plaza would look like in the future. The 50-foot-long street mural spelling out Black Lives Matter on 16th Street was created during the 2020 protests following the killing of George Floyd. According to a DDOT statement, work on the plaza will take 6 to 8 weeks to complete. Washington, D.C. Mayor Bowser said that the plaza will be part of D.C.'s America 250 mural project, where we will invite students and artists to create new murals across all 8 wards. Reconstruction on DC's Black Lives Matter plaza began this morning. The plaza before construction began. Daylight savings time has started. Here's how to adjust. Wide shot rear view of business people crossing downtown street during evening commute. Like many Americans, Pittsburgh area resident Josh Lucas wishes the time change didn't have to happen. You get acclimated to a way of being, and then all of a sudden, the sky is a different color, and you still have to function in the normal way, said Lucas. And it's not always easy to keep functioning normally. In fact, most sleep researchers and clinicians say that the spring forward time change is bad for our health. In the days following the time change, the country sees a higher incidence of car accidents, strokes, and heart attacks. There are more fatal overdoses and suicides. People suffer more migraines and are at greater risk of getting injured at work. One study even found that IVF patients were more likely to experience a spontaneous pregnancy loss, though only if they'd previously miscarried. These findings make sense to Brant Hassler, a sleep and circadian researcher at the University of Pittsburgh. He says when the clock jumps forward, it disrupts not just our sleep, but also our circadian rhythm. The circadian rhythm exists in almost every cell of the body. Hassler likens it to an orchestra of clocks, with the conductor directing from the hypothalamus, a small region within the center of the brain. This clock orchestra not only determines when we sleep, but also regulates our metabolism, body temperature, our emotions, aspects of cognition, and several hormones. And switching from standard to daylight savings time throws our clocks out of tune, much like jet lag, making us irritable and tired. Because our circadian rhythm is synced with the sun, having less light in the morning and more in the evening makes it harder to be alert during the day and sleep at night. Therefore, some sleep even later during daylight savings compared to standard, says Dr. Indira, who specializes in sleep medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Guru told NPR via email that people usually feel back to normal after a week or so, but warned the time change sometimes triggers chronic sleep issues that persist for months. Most people in the U.S. are already sleep deprived, which makes the sudden loss of 1 more hour of sleep particularly painful, she says. Guru and Hassler oppose efforts to abolish standard time and lock the clock on daylight savings. Daylight savings time is contrary to hundreds of thousands of years of human biology. As we evolved to wake up with the sun and go to sleep when it gets dark, Hassler says. It makes sense to me just to stick with that, rather than trying to monkey about it he says. Who's affected the most? The time change affects everyone, though it disrupts some more than others, says Allison Harvey, who runs a sleep and mood research clinic at the University of California, Berkeley. People living towards the western edges of a time zone will likely feel these efforts more because the sun rises later in these communities. For example, on Monday, the sun rises in Boston at 7:04 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But in Kalamazoo, Michigan, on the other side of the Eastern Time Zone, the sun doesn't rise until 8:02 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. People with depression and bipolar disorder are particularly vulnerable since these patients already have difficulty keeping a regular sleep schedule. Sleep pushes our moods around, she says. So of course, sleep and mental health challenges go hand in hand. Teenagers are also in for a rough week. At the start of puberty, the circadian rhythm shifts so that our bodies get tired and wake up much later than most school start times. As a result, many young people are already sleep deprived, so waking an hour earlier will make them even more exhausted. Harvey warned that over the next week, some young people might have more conflict with their parents or do worse in school. In addition to increased health and safety risks, how some people view the world might be skewed this week. Research shows we're less generous and make worse investment decisions during the first week of daylight savings. Federal judges are likely to issue harsher sentences the Monday after the time change. So how to adapt to the time change? To adjust, we need to help the symphony of circadian clocks to get in sync with the new time as soon as possible. Much like adapting to jet lag, we can adjust by taking advantage of external cues that reset our clocks, including light exposure, exercise, and even what we eat and drink. Probably the most powerful of these cues is light. When you wake up, go outside in the morning, as this bright light exposure tells your body it's time to be awake. Hassler says, for this to be effective, people need to be in the natural light for at least 20 minutes, though more is better. But Harvey says any amount can help. If it's still dark out when your alarm goes off, Harvey suggests turning on all the lights in your house to signal to your brain the day is starting. Still, outside light is far brighter, even on a cloudy day, so try to get outdoors as soon as the sun's up. Also, get some exercise. As research suggests, physical activity can improve your sleep. Some research into circadian rhythms and exercise shows that physical activity can be another cue for your inner clocks to reset. Recent clinical trials have found that exercising in the morning or early afternoon may help push your rhythms toward an earlier schedule. Watch your alcohol and caffeine intake. Don't rely on alcohol to wind down, because while drinking can help you fall asleep, that sleep tends to be lower quality. More frequent cannabis use can also disrupt sleep, and cut out the afternoon coffees. Caffeine has a long half-life and can still be in your system by bedtime. It may be a struggle to get to bed early, so watch your evening routine and keep good sleep hygiene. Turn off phones and other distractions, and get to bed early, says Harvey. Also, try not to stress about getting enough rest, as that can make it even harder to fall asleep, says Harvey. Most of us should feel back to normal in a week or two, so be patient with yourself and others. The human sleep system is a flexible system, and we will all survive this, Harvey says. U.S. Education Department says it is cutting nearly half of all staff. A man walks past the U.S. Department of Education building in Washington, D.C. on February 7th. The Trump administration is working towards its promise of eliminating the U.S. Department of Education. On Tuesday evening, the department released a statement saying it would cut nearly 50% of the department's workforce. Impacted staff will be placed on its administrative leave beginning March 21st, according to the announcement. The statement confirms all divisions within the agency will be hit by cuts, but also says it will continue to deliver programs protected by law, including formula funding student loans, Pell Grants, funding for special needs students, competitive grant making. Today's reduction in force reflects the Department of Education's commitment to efficiency, accountability, and ensuring that resources are directed where they matter most, to students, parents, and teachers. U.S. Secretary of Education Linda McConan said in the statement, "I appreciate the work of all the dedicated public servants and their contributions to the department. This is a significant step toward restoring the greatness of the United States education system." According to an announcement, more than 1,300 positions will be cut as a result of this reduction in force. Roughly another 600 employees accepted voluntary resignations or retired over the last 2 months. AFGE, a local 252 union that represents education department employees, released a statement in which its president, Shreya Smith, said, "We will fight these draconian cuts and urge all Americans to stand up and contact their members of Congress to protect the Department of Education's vital work, working people, and our nation by rejecting all these political games." Minutes later, AFGE Local 252 told NPR that Smith was laid off, along with 5 of the chapter's other union officers. Earlier on Tuesday, department employees received an email advising them to vacate all department offices by 6 p.m. Staff were instructed by the department's Office of Security, Facilities, and Logistics to plan to work from home on Wednesday. Employees of their department shared the email with NPR. "We are not naming them because they feared retribution."
Department employees have spent the past several weeks anticipating sweeping staff cuts by the Trump administration. This Thursday, agency heads are expected to turn in their reorganization plans to the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, OMB, and the U.S. Office of Personnel Management. A guidance memo from OMB and OPM sent in late February instructed agency heads to achieve large-scale reductions in force RIFs through attrition and by eliminating positions that are not required. Already, at least 75 education department staff have been placed on paid administrative leave. According to a tally by AFGE Local 252, this account does not include managers and supervisors. Many of those workers on paid leave attended a diversity, equity, and inclusion workshop the department has offered for many years, including during the first Trump administration. The union also says at least 75 probationary department staff who were hired more recently are legally easier to lay off, have also had their jobs terminated.